gathered today for a very special occasion, which is the naming of the recipient of our annual Charles W. Colson Conviction and Courage Award. And it's my pleasure this morning to honor a man who has been a faithful stalwart of the gospel in the academy, in our country, and around the world. He is an expert in natural law, an advocate for cultivating virtue in the public sphere, a protector of human rights, and an international leader in bioethics. And we're incredibly pleased to welcome Princeton professor of jurisprudence and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, Dr. Robert P. George. Please stand and welcome to Biola University. Before you hear more about Dr. George, let me give you a little background on this honored tradition at Biola called the Colson Award, which is now in its 9th year. In 2014, Biola University established, with the permission of Dr. Colson, the Charles W. Colson Award for Conviction and Courage. It was named to honor the legacy of the Christian leader Chuck Colson, founder of Prison Fellowship and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Chuck Colson became an acquaintance of mine 25 years ago, and over time actually became a dear friend. And he loved Biola University, believing that this university was truly among the strongest of Christian higher education institutions. And he has been here numerous times. And how many of you students have heard of Chuck Colson? Okay, there's a handful. Well, let me give you some background, because most of you didn't raise your hands. In 1973, long before you were born, at the age of 42, Chuck Colson committed his life to Christ after pleading guilty to obstruction of justice in the Watergate scandal, having worked in the administration of President Richard Nixon. Chuck Colson entered Alabama's Maxwell Prison in 1974 as a new Christian. And in 1976, he launched Prison Fellowship, which has since become the world's largest outreach to prisoners, ex-prisoners, and families, with ministry in 113 nations. Mr. Colson also founded the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, authored over 30 books, began a daily radio show called Breakpoint, which continues to air today to over 1,200 networks and is heard by 8 million people. In 1993, Chuck Colson was awarded the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion, the world's largest annual award in the field of religion. Chuck Colson lived a life of biblical conviction and the courage to advocate for truth, even when it was difficult, even when it was unfashionable. His life is an inspiring example of what it means to impact the world for Christ through the virtues of conviction and courage, something that we at Biola University strive for. Recipients of Biola's Colson Award have been those who have advanced Christ's kingdom through evangelism, discipleship, Christian worldview training, individuals who have defended religious freedom and advocated for the weak and defenseless, men and women who model bold, visionary, and courageous Christian leadership for the next generation. And today we honor Robbie George as our 9th recipient of the Colson Award, following these previously worthy recipients: Chuck Colson himself posthumously in 2014, Britain's Baroness Caroline Cox in 2015, Canada's Paul Marshall in 2016, American disabilities rights advocate Johnny Erickson Tata in 2017, Egypt's Mama Maggie Gobran in 2018, American civil rights leader John Perkins in 2019, Amsterdam's Brother Andrew in 2020 and 21, and last year, the late Latin American evangelist Luis Palau. With this award, we seek to highlight individuals who demonstrate commitment to the unshakable truths of biblical worldview and who embody biblical convictions even in the face of risks or challenges. And this is certainly true of the late Chuck Colson, and it is true of the individual whose life and legacy we honor today, Dr. Robert George, a friend of many, including Mr. Colson. Dr. Robert George has both conviction and courage. And I've often said that conviction without courage goes nowhere. And courage without conviction goes anywhere. but conviction with courage goes somewhere. And that somewhere is making a difference in the world for the good, for the cause of Christ. And this is the story of our recipient today. Robert George is a well-known intellectual who has championed religious freedom and public virtue in a culture where those ideas are becoming less and less popular. He is one of the most important advocates for Christian values in the field of moral and legal philosophy today, and is a significant pioneer in the natural law tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas. He holds staunchly to certain moral absolutes and true human goods, such as the sanctity of life, the good of friendship, marriage, and more. He has put these values into practice across the world, including through his service on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, on the President's Council on Bioethics, as a chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and on UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. Chuck Colson was a close friend of Dr. George and greatly admired him for his leadership as a Catholic layperson who was committed to collaboration between Catholics and Protestants for the sake of advancing God's work among his people. Dr. George's work in these areas has included projects such as Evangelicals and Catholics Together, the Manhattan Declaration, and producing an ethics training series called Doing the Right Thing, featuring our own Biola faculty member, Dr. Scott Ray. So we're grateful to continue that spirit of partnership between faithful believers of both traditions with this award today. Dr. George is a man of deep devotion to Jesus, which animates every aspect of his life. He is known for courageously and gently sharing the gospel with his colleagues, students, and peers. He is a man of gentle, Christ-like kindness who bridges ideological divides to learn from and honor those with very different viewpoints to his own, while standing firmly for his convictions. And this Christ-like charity was demonstrated a few years ago when Robbie George and Cornel West, both here, filled the gymnasium here at Biola University to talk about how do we live amongst our differences in ways that are filled with grace and filled with compassion for one another. And for all these reasons and more, the nominating committee felt that Dr. Robert P. George was a clear choice for our 9th annual Colson Award recipient. And Biola's Board of Trustees bestowed by unanimous vote this award upon him back in September, Dr. Robert George, as the 9th recipient, 2023 recipient of the Chuck Colson Award for Conviction and Courage. So I've asked Mr. Michael Maples, our board chair, to join me to assist with this award presentation. And now I'd like to also invite, with your applause, Dr. George to the stage today.
Dr. George, in celebration and honor of your contribution to the world as a bold and influential Christian thought leader, a man with fearless conviction devoted to the preservation of moral virtue and the protection of life all around the world, a man with the courage to stand for truth even when it's unpopular, all while authentically exuding the love of Christ. On behalf of Biola University's Board of Trustees and these amazing students who desire to live lives of conviction and courage wherever God takes them, we present to you the 2023 Charles W. Colson Conviction and Courage Award. Congratulations.
Now, one more round of applause for our chapel speaker this morning, Dr. Robbie George.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, President Corey, and thank you, Mr. Naples. I really appreciate this great honor. President Corey, I only wish that my more secular liberal Princeton colleagues could be here to hear me described as gentle and kind. They would be surprised, but I hope pleased. Chuck Colson was a great man, a great and bold Christian witness, as President Corey said. He was also a very, very dear friend of mine, so I can't tell you how much it means to me, and I hope you will convey this to all the members of the board, how much it means to me to be receiving this award in his honor. You learned a bit about Chuck Colson, those of you who didn't know about Chuck, from the president's remarks, but I would just lay some emphasis under a couple of things. Chuck was a man who rose to the heights of power in the Nixon administration. If anybody had the ear of the President of the United States, it was Chuck Colson. But then he fell in that scandal to the depths of shame, ending up in a federal prison. That's a long way down. But it was in Christ, when Jesus embraced him and he embraced Jesus back, that he was able to overcome both that pride that characterized him when he was at the heights of power and that despair that came with the shame of being implicated in a world historical, national and international scandal. And he took that gift of conversion, and he used it for good, establishing prison fellowship ministries, as President Corey said, the largest and most important outreach to prisoners anywhere in the world. And I would note that he could have just left it there, and he would have been praised and thanked by everybody across the spectrum. Being kind to prisoners makes almost nobody mad. He could have redeemed himself in the eyes of the power elite. But precisely because he was animated by the Spirit of Jesus, he had to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and not just about our obligations to prisoners. And so he spoke out boldly on even the most controversial issues. He took stands that would not endear him to the power elite, speaking out on behalf of the sanctity of human life in all stages and conditions. Marriage is the conjugal union of husband and wife, religious freedom and the rights of conscience. And he took a new set of slings and arrows as a result of that witness. But he was always joyful, always happy, secure, as you will be secure if you do this, young men and women. Always secure in the knowledge that he was doing the right thing. That's irreplaceable, and there's nothing more important than that. No worldly praise, no worldly acclaim can ever substitute for knowing you're doing the right thing. Now, I'm here to talk with you this morning about religious liberty. We as Christians and as Americans believe in religious liberty, and not just for ourselves and our fellow Christians. We believe in religious liberty for people of all faiths and shades of belief. And we believe in religious liberty for them as well as for us equally. But why is religious liberty, religious freedom, so important? Why does it merit this special concern from us, and we hope from our leaders in church and state? In order to answer those questions, I think we need to begin with a still more basic question. What is religion? Well, in its fullest and most robust sense, religion is the human person's being in right relation to God, to the divine, to the more than merely human source or sources of meaning and value. In the perfect realization of the good of religion, one would achieve the relationship that the divine, God himself, at least from the vantage point of those of us who are Christians, wishes us to have with him. Now, of course, different traditions of faith have different views of what constitutes religion in its fullest and most robust sense, where the full truth lies. There are different doctrines, different scriptures, different ideas of what is true about spiritual things and what it means to be in proper relationship to the more than merely human source or sources of meaning and value, what different traditions understand as divinity. Now, for my part, I believe that reason has a very large role to play for each of us in deciding where spiritual truth most robustly is to be found. And by reason here, I mean not only our capacity for what Aristotle called practical reasoning, that is, reasoning with a view to action, moral reasoning, but also our capacities for understanding and evaluating claims of all sorts, logical, historical, scientific, and so forth. But one need not agree with me about that, about the high role of reason in the spiritual quest, in order to affirm with me that there is a distinct intrinsic human good of religion, a good that uniquely shapes one's pursuit of and participation in all the aspects of human flourishing, and that one begins to realize and participate in from the moment one begins the quest to understand what the ultimate truth is, the more than merely human truth about meaning and value, and to live authentically by ordering one's life in line with one's best judgments of the truth in religious matters. If I am right, then the existential raising of religious questions, the honest identification of answers, and the fulfilling of what one sincerely believes to be one's duties in light of those answers are all parts of the good of religion. But if that is true, then respect for a person's well-being, a person's flourishing, or more simply, respect for the person, demands respect for his or her flourishing as a seeker of religious truth and as one who lives in line with his or her own best judgments of what is in fact true in spiritual matters. And that, in turn, requires respect for everyone's liberty in the religious quest, the quest to understand religious truth and to live in line with it. Now, because faith of any type, including religious faith, cannot be authentic, it cannot be faith unless it is free, respect for the person, that is to say, respect for his or her dignity as a free and rational creature, requires respect for his or her religious liberty. That's why it makes sense from the point of view of reason and not merely from the point of view of revealed teaching, though many faiths, including ours, do proclaim the right to religious freedom on theological and not merely philosophical grounds, to understand religious freedom as what we today call a human right, a fundamental human right. So it's important for us as Christians, and indeed as human beings, to stand and, where necessary, as it is so often here in our own country and in the world, to fight for religious freedom for all and in its most robust sense. The right to religious freedom must never be reduced, as some would reduce it, to a mere right to worship. It is a right that pertains not only to what the believer does in church or chapel, or synagogue or mosque or temple, or in our homes at mealtime or before bed. It is rather the right not only to do all those things, but to express one's faith in the public as well as the private sphere, and to act as the American abolitionists and civil rights campaigners acted, and as the champions of the rights of unborn children today act, on our religiously informed convictions about justice and the common good in carrying out our duties of citizenship. Moreover, the right to religious freedom, by its very nature, includes the right to leave a religious community, one whose convictions one no longer shares, and the right to join another community of faith. When I chaired the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a great deal of our work had to do with protecting the rights of people around the world in under regimes of government where religious freedom was not respected, to protect their right to leave a faith when they came no longer to believe it, but perhaps to believe another faith, to convert from one religion to another religion. And respect for that right strictly excludes the use of civil authority to punish or impose civic disabilities on those who leave or change faiths. In many places in the world today, you are punished, sometimes with prison, sometimes just with the loss of civic standing, loss of certain rights of citizenship, for leaving one faith and joining another. Now, from the perspective of any believer, the further away one gets from the truths of faith in all dimensions, the less fulfillment is available. But that does not mean that even a primitive and superstition-laden faith is utterly devoid of value, or that there is no right to religious freedom for people who practice such a faith. Nor does it mean that atheists have no right to religious freedom. Respect for the good of religion requires that civil authority respect and nurture conditions in which people can engage in the sincere religious quest and live lives of authenticity, reflecting their best judgments as to the truth of spiritual matters. To compel an atheist to perform acts that are premised on theistic beliefs that he cannot in good conscience share is to deny him the fundamental bit of the good of religion that is his, namely, living with honesty and integrity in line with his best judgments about ultimate reality. Coercing him to perform religious acts does him no good, since faith really must be free to be faith. You can compel the outward manifestations of faith, but you cannot compel, no government can get to the internal acts of intellect and will that are the substance of faith, and therefore to coerce him dishonors his dignity as a free and rational being. Again, when I chaired the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I would speak out, as I did, for the rights of atheists who are under compulsion from religiously authoritarian regimes, people would sometimes my fellow Christians would ask, Professor George, you as a Christian, why are you defending those atheists? Because they're human beings with human dignity. And they have the same right to engage freely in the religious quest and to live with authenticity and integrity in line with their best answers to those questions as you have and I have as Christians, or as our Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist friends have. Now, of course, there are limits to the freedom that must be respected for the sake of the good of religion and the dignity of the human person as a being whose integral fulfillment includes the spiritual quest and the ordering of one's life in line with one's best judgments of what spiritual truth requires. Obviously, grave injustices can be and have been committed by sincere religious believers for the sake of their faith. So the presumption in favor of respecting liberty, though it must be powerful and broad, is not without limits. Even the great end of getting right with God cannot justify a morally bad means, even for a sincere believer. I don't doubt the sincerity of the ancient Aztecs in practicing human sacrifice, or the sincerity of those in the history of various traditions of faith, including our own, who used coercion and even torture in the cause of what they believed was religiously required. But these things are deeply wrong and should not be tolerated or defended in the name of religious freedom. To suppose otherwise is to back oneself into the rather awkward position of supposing that violations of religious freedom and other injustices of equal gravity must be respected for the sake of religious freedom. And obviously that can't be right. Still, to overcome the powerful and broad presumption in favor of religious liberty, to be justified in requiring the believer to do something contrary to his faith, or forbidding the believer to do something his conscience requires, political authority must meet a heavy burden. But conscience has burdens proper to itself as well. To understand the nature of conscience and the ground of its claims to freedom, we would do well to turn to the great 19th century theologian and leading intellectual figure, John Henry Newman. Newman understood human beings as free and rational creatures whose freedom and rationality reflects their having been made in the very image and likeness of God, which is simply to say Newman was a Christian. Newman's dedication to the rights of conscience is well known. Even long after his famous conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism, he famously toasted, quote, toasted as in after-dinner toasts, toasted, he said, I don't like to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, but if I must, he said, I toast the Pope, yes, but conscience first. Now, our obligation to follow conscience was, Newman insisted, in a profound sense then, primary and even overriding. Did he believe, as a Catholic, in the importance of following the teachings of the Pope? Well, yes, of course, sure. As a Catholic, he affirmed broad papal authority. He said, though, if, however, conflict were to arise such that conscience, formed as best one could form it, forbade one's following the Pope, well, it is the obligation of conscience, Newman insisted, that must prevail. Now, many of our secular progressive contemporaries, and even those of our fellow Christians who've traded in Christian moral teachings on such issues as the sanctity of human life and marriage, will be tempted to see in their own view of conscience something like what Newman's arguing for here. They would misinterpret, in my view, Newman as arguing that we have an interior self-liberating referral service that guides us by our feelings, that we are autonomous creatures who can do as we please, unburdened by obligations that don't arise out of our own internal sense of feeling. But Newman, as the most powerful defender of freedom of conscience the historical record provides, held what was actually a very, very different view of conscience, and it's really important to understand this. It's a view that's deeply at odds with the contemporary secular progressive view, and Newman summed up the difference himself. Let me quote him. "Conscience has rights because it has duties. But in this age, with a large portion of the public, it is the very right and freedom of conscience to dispense with conscience. Conscience is a stern monitor. But in this century," he's talking about the 19th century here, "in this century, it has been superseded by a counterfeit, which the 18 centuries prior to it never heard of and could not have mistaken for it if they had. It is the right of self-will." Self-will, consulting my feelings, my interior sense, is not conscience. Conscience is rather one's last best judgment informed by faith and reason of what I must or must not do. Conscience, as Newman understood it, is the very opposite of autonomy in the modern sense. It is not a writer of permission slips. It is not in the business of licensing us to do as we please, or conferring on us the right, if I can quote an infamous Supreme Court decision here, the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Rather, conscience is indeed one's last best judgment, specifying the bearing of moral principles one grasps, yet in no way makes up for oneself, on concrete proposals for action. Conscience identifies our duties under a moral law that we ourselves do not make and does not reduce to our feelings. It speaks of what one must do or must not do. Understood in this way, conscience is indeed what Newman said it was, a stern monitor. Now contrast this understanding of conscience with what Newman condemns as its counterfeit, conscience as self-will. Well, that idea of conscience makes it a matter of feeling or emotion, not faith and reason. It's concerned not so much with the identification of what one has a duty to do or not do, one's feelings or desires to the contrary notwithstanding, but rather and precisely with sorting out one's feelings and indeed identifying one's very self with one's feelings. Notice how much that's going on today? This is the view at the heart of contemporary identitarian ideology. Conscience as self-will identifies permissions, not obligations. It licenses behavior by establishing that one doesn't feel too badly about doing it, or at least one doesn't feel badly enough about doing it that one prefers the alternative of not doing it. We need to stand with Newman. His key distinction is between conscience authentically understood and self-will, conscience as the permissions department. His core insight is that conscience has rights because it has duties. The right to follow one's conscience and the obligation to respect the consciences of others, especially in matters of faith, where the right of conscience takes the form of religious liberty, obtain not because people as autonomous agents should be able to do whatever they please. They obtain and are stringent and sometimes overriding because people have duties and the obligation to fulfill them. The duty to follow conscience is a duty to do things or refrain from doing things, not because one wants to follow one's duty, but even if one strongly does not want to follow it. The right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, whether one welcomes that obligation or must overcome a strong aversion in order to fulfill it. If there's a form of words that sums up the antithesis of Newman's view of conscience as a stern monitor, it is the imbecilic slogan that will ever stand as a verbal monument to what used to be known as, you guys will remember this, the me generation. Do you remember the slogan of the me generation? Some of the people of my generation will remember it. If it feels good, do it. That's not conscience. 60 years ago, Martin Luther King responded in his letter from Birmingham jail to those who criticized his program of civil disobedience as mere willful lawbreaking. Here's what Dr. King said: "I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all." Now, King turned not inward to his own feelings of being aggrieved by the law, not to the intuitions of his autonomous self, and not even to a claim of his own rights. Instead, he turned to moral responsibility, to obligation, to duty. It's not me generation stuff. King, like Newman, understood this as a duty to principles of justice we do not create, but to which we must respond. As the Declaration of Independence teaches us, prior to any laws made by men are the immutable standards of justice, standards by which we judge whether the laws are just and can rightfully command our obedience. These standards of the equal dignity of all human persons, of their equal freedom and the accountability of government to the people, apply not just to our own laws, but to those of other nations as well. As the United Nations recognized in its 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, religious freedom is an essential principle of justice in all nations and in all ages. Our own Congress said the same thing in the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. All of us have a duty in conscience to work for religious freedom, not simply for ourselves, not simply for our fellow Christians, but for all. Again, I thank you for this high honor, Mr. President, and thank all of you for your kind attention.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.